So this week on Behind the Headlines, we're going to take on a pretty big topic, which is sexual violence. It's certainly been a topic of great interest in student activism on college campuses for the past year or more. And then just yesterday, the Stanford University administration released the Stanford Campus Climate Survey, which stated that more than a third of undergraduate women have been subject to unwanted sexual aggression, whether that's termed assault or misconduct. There's been swift reaction to that report, hasn't there been?
There's some, I think, disbelief on campus a little bit at how the results were presented in particular. One of the top numbers that Stanford pointed out in its press release yesterday was that 1.9% of all students at Stanford, male and female, undergraduate and graduates, have been sexually assaulted at one point in their time on campus. And people have called that number out of touch, totally unbelievable. It's just a very low number. And particularly by averaging the number of male and female students, and based on gender, they're subject to totally different rates of sexual violence that can skew the number absolutely. So people have definitely taken issue with that. And then there's this difference between sexual assault and sexual misconduct.
Different categorizations.
Right, which has created some confusion and also spurred a lot of criticism. The way that Stanford crafted the survey questions, it meant that students had to check two different boxes to be considered the more serious sexual assault. So they had to be both incapacitated and intoxicated and to be considered a sexual assault. And otherwise, if they just checked incapacitated, they were categorized as sexual misconduct. So the sexual misconduct numbers were very high. I think it was 14.2% across campus, and very high numbers for undergraduate female students also.
Yeah, in the 30%.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of criticism that the very low number of the more serious sexual assault and the very high number of sexual misconduct was created by this confusion around the definitions and the categorization.
Definitions play a large role in all of this reporting. I mean, there's this report, and some people, Stanford said that it should not be compared to the results of other college campus surveys. But then there's also, there was a crime report that came out earlier this week for Stanford that used totally different definitions or categorizations, I guess, of
that report also used, it's the, the Safety, Security, and Fire Report, and that is, they used Clary Act federal law definitions. But that also, and we can get into that a little bit later, is quite different from what state law also says in terms of how it defines.
And I want to note also that a point of the Campus Climate Survey is to get beyond what's reported in these kind of the safety reports in the Clery Act, because there's such low rates of reporting that the federal government issued a statement in April 2014 calling on all colleges and universities to issue campus climate surveys because they're anonymous, and they can, if they're done correctly, they can get at student perceptions and numbers that aren't going to be reported to either campus authorities or to the police.
Yeah. So just to walk back a little bit, so 9,000 students took this?
Yeah,
8,000, 9,000?
About 9,000 students, a 59% response rate, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
2/3 of undergraduates and a little bit more than half of graduates responded. And there are also pretty even numbers of male and female undergraduate students who responded, which was pretty good.
Yeah. I was looking at some other of the campus climate surveys, Harvard and Yale. They had different response rates for undergraduate men and women, so like a 10% differential for some of those. This was much more even.
It was. I think it was 67% of undergraduate females and 65% of undergraduate males.
So the administration itself, I read the press release, they weren't exactly saying that this was a great result to hear that there are that many people who have been assaulted in some way or another. But their press release kind of also didn't say that they were analogous to any other universities, and I think that was one of the sticking points.
Yeah, they
Some
made,
activists
multiple times throughout, or maybe once in the press release and then in an executive summary for the report itself, or the survey results, really cautioning, do not compare these results. In particular, there was this huge, one of the largest surveys of its kind on campus sexual violence conducted by the American Association of Universities with 27 colleges and universities, many of them, peer schools to Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and others. And those results recently came out. And so I think even in Stanford's, FAQ about our survey results, please don't compare to the AAU survey. So they were very careful about not wanting to be categorized in the same way.
Yeah, but that's really a sticking point with some people who are looking at the numbers in the Stanford report, thinking that this is really a spin. It's a spin because they mention 1.9% of students having been assaulted, but that combines the men and the women. It doesn't get to the true rate, if you will.
I spoke with a student this morning who sort of wondered, I'm sure there's plenty going on behind the scenes of survey construction and why they didn't, participate in the AAU survey. But, wondering now that these results came out the way they did, Stanford being very careful to say that we can't be compared. And here are our results, but they're not relevant to all these other results that are coming out.
Yeah, that show much higher rates. Right. Has to do with definitions and methodology. I did want to point out, though, that I was particularly interested in whether or not there was bias in the surveys and how did they account for that bias. Stanford said that in addition to the survey that they did of the students, they also did a random sampling survey of 1,000 students, and the one thing that they pointed out was that the rate of sexual assault was the same in the random sampling versus the survey. So they're trying to kind of confirm the reliability of the survey data. Harvard did some sort of very complicated weighting, WEIGHT, weighting of the responses to make sure that theirs was representative. So
theirs was as well, too. I think only for female grad students there were some statistically significant differences.
Okay, so this issue is obviously something that concerns people on the campus. Sue, you've looked at kind of definitions of groping, stalking, rape as determined by the law, federal or state. And we should just touch upon that a little bit just to get to the seriousness.
Right. I think there are some confusing things about this climate survey that Stanford did, in that they defined the more serious sexual assaults as things that involved groping, penetration. And actually, if you look at the state law, California law defines a sexual assault as any type of unwanted touching done under force. Okay. However, then it breaks down further in terms of that there's something called sexual battery. So if you touch someone, let's say you're drunk and you push them against the wall and you start fondling them, that is a felony sexual battery, and you can do up to, I believe it's a year in the county jail, or the court has a discretion to send you to state prison from between 2 and 4 years, and you pay a $10,000 fine. If you just come up behind somebody on campus and grab their rear end, that again is a sexual battery, and that's a misdemeanor, and you face a 6-month county jail sentence and $2,000.
And those kind of assaults aren't they counted in the same category in the crime report?
The crime report. I'm trying to think how they did that. They did break out things in terms of, once again, between I guess everything that has to do with penetration, and this is another thing that changed. The Clary Act, which is the federal law that requires the campuses to basically break down all of their crime statistics, found that they changed in 2013 to say that any kind of forcible penetration, be it oral or by object or anything else, goes into the rape category. So basically anything else that they sort of parsed out had to do with fondling, like fondling and I think statutory rape, those types of things with underage persons. Those are sort of they're not exactly minor crimes, but they're not put into that same major sexual assault category.
We were talking earlier about this, the term misconduct sounds in some ways lightweight. You know, it just sounds like someone did something absent-mindedly, inappropriately. But certainly there are clear cases of misconduct that can be quite severe and quite serious.
Well, I think the other thing too in both of these reports is the issue of misconduct. It really doesn't tell the whole picture in terms of the law. I mean, legally, what you're doing is against the law. And when they have a document like this, which spells out all of these different definitions and how you're supposed to behave on campus and what the university is going to have what their expectations of students are, it doesn't get drilled down to that level of them saying anywhere in these documents. And just in case, even though we define things this way in this document, this way in another document, the reality is that you're committing a crime. The other thing that's kind of interesting in this particular report, the crime report, is that they do parse out the disciplinary actions and the number of arrests, but it's only for violations of the liquor law, drug violations, carrying a weapon on campus, but there's nothing else related to any other crime. And glaringly, with all of the issues surrounding sexual assaults, and there's nothing that separates out and identifies any arrests or any kind of disciplinary
Yeah,
action.
and something fascinating, Yale, which participated in the AAU study, and each of those schools produced their own reports as part of that, and then there was an overall survey report. In Yale's own results reported the past year in 2014 of reported sexual assaults, disciplinary actions, respondent and complainant students, how it was handled, incredibly detailed documentation, which is pretty rare in these kind of cases. And a lot of student advocates, faculty advocates who are really pushing for reform at Stanford have been calling for that kind of transparency for a long time.
I noticed in the climate survey for Harvard that there are a lot of details as far as when assaults occurred, like which year of a student's
Stanford didn't do.
tenure. A lot of details in there. So looks like many campuses are kind of moving forward, changing policy and procedure on this issue. And why don't we kind of broaden out a little bit and just talk about some of the student activism for the past year or two nationwide. There was a woman from Columbia University who had a mattress that she was
Emma
carrying.
Solkowitz carried her dorm mattress around for months and months. She was a visual art student for her senior thesis after she was sexually assaulted, and the Columbia student who perpetrated the assault was not disciplined as far as she thought he should have been. She decided that she was going to carry around this mattress until he was expelled, and she ended up carrying it around, I think, for the rest of the school year. And it became this symbol. There were carry this weight protests across the nation, including at Stanford, where students marched carrying their dorm mattresses. At Stanford, some students brought them into this incredible faculty educational event where there was administrators at a table, and the mattresses were leaned up against a wall next to them, and it's just this incredible image.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of activism last year, and many, Emma Solkowitz, there was Alex Brodsky at Yale University, who is now nationally known sexual assault advocate, and she runs an organization working on Title IX. Leah Francis became a known national name at Stanford. And she brought her case forward publicly in June of 2014, and that really kicked off everything on campus here.
Yeah, it seems like she really galvanized.
She totally did.
She was. I think she even said that people needed a focal point, and she became that focal point,
completely.
whether she wanted to be that, play that role or not.
Yeah, and there are a lot of students this year who are sort of trying to carry that torch. During orientation week, a group of students stood in White Plaza holding up signs that said "Rape happens here." They stood there silently for about an hour, just as people were, parents, new students are wandering through. They really wanted to just raise awareness with new students. They also distributed educational flyers with very straightforward statistics, both nationally and locally, about sexual assault. they posted up flyers with resources, you know, and this grid of what to do when you're sexually assaulted, if you want to tell someone or if you don't. And they were really, really trying to raise awareness at this particular time of the year, too. The first few weeks of the school year are called the red zone, and they're thought to be when students are at a higher risk for sexual assault.
Wow. So why do you think this issue has resonated so much throughout the nation in different college campuses? Is it a matter of timing? Is there something that happened, say, 5 years ago that really coalesced everybody? Any thoughts?
No, that's a hard question.
Obviously, it's serious, very serious issue. And
it is, and
needs
it's
to be
certainly
addressed.
not new either. I mean, if you look back at Stanford's history, there was a climate survey in 1988 that found that 1 in 3 Stanford women, 1 in 8 Stanford men reported being pressured to have sex against their will. There was a similar kind of student activism movement. There was this group called the Stanford Rape Education Project that did a ton of education and organization of awareness and different events. So this is really part of Stanford's history, and it was somehow just revived in recent years. And I think there's a lot of I don't know, there's this persistent feeling, which I think has just unfortunately been sort of encouraged by the report, of also distrust of the administration and not really being sure if, you know, whose best interests they have in mind. Is it the administration and the university's reputation, or is it the students and their safety?
Yeah, the role of the university is particularly interesting in these kinds of cases, and we can touch upon what happened last year as far as the task force and recommendations that were made for changing policy. But, you know, the university is not a law enforcement agency per se, and yet they have the responsibility through Title IX federal policy to be investigating these incidents and coming to some sort of conclusions and meting out accountability, which I think there's been some grappling around that, and certainly some divisive, you know, opinions there. The task force came out with a recommendation last spring for expected expulsion for anyone found responsible for sexual assault. Was this a result that got unanimous support, or was there still some, you know, fractiousness over the direction of the university?
I mean, among student activists, certainly that was what they were hoping for, and I think that a lot of people were doubtful that would actually happen, and they would recommend that, because it is still seen as pretty radical. Not very many colleges or universities have expulsion as the expected sanction. And from what I understand about the task force itself, which was made up of a lot of differing opinions around this, you know, very contentious issue, they eventually came to a unanimous conclusion about it, and they wouldn't have recommended it without, you know, the whole group agreeing on it. So, and that's pretty interesting that this group of administrators, staff, faculty, men and women, old and young, came in with very different opinions about it and came out with that recommendation. And they also recommended that the university replace its current adjudication process with a new pilot program that's going to start rolling out this fall. So that will be really interesting to see how that actually plays out, though it's unclear, you know, how much information will be released about it, probably close to none.
Okay, well, I think we're going to move into this video that we've lined up. Elena, explain a little bit about Cirie Path and the woman who's speaking in the video.
So the video you're about to see is of a student named Alexis Callan, who's a sophomore at Stanford, and she has made it her mission to push the university to pave and light this path on campus that students refer to as Cirie Path. It's really rocky and uneven. It's this dirt road that runs from near a fraternity, Kappa Alpha, through these sort of creepy oak trees towards the back of another student residence. And it's a commonly used route to get to fraternity parties, other social events, people coming to and from student residences in the area at night. So she's really concerned about the safety there, and also that it's a potential place for sexual assaults to occur. The Brock Turner case, who is a former Stanford student who was found on top of an unconscious woman less than 0.2 miles from the Cirie Path in January, and he's actually going to be in court on Monday facing some serious sexual assault charges. So although no reports of sexual assault have been made on the Cirie Path, Alexis is really concerned about it, and she's going to spend the next few years pushing to get some lighting and paving or some alternatives to make it a safer place for students to walk.
Okay, well, let's hear from her directly then.
So Cirie Path currently stretches 528 feet, starting from a paved path between the Kappa Alpha fraternity and EBF, which is a co-op, and leads to a cluster of houses, which houses 680, which is another co-op, Kappa Sigma, which is a fraternity, and Theta Delta, which is another fraternity. So in total, there's about 330 students living around the path, and they all have friends that are obviously coming to visit them on the path. And so the actual path is quite rocky. There's no pavement, no leveling, no lights, and there's trees all around it, which offer large shaded areas where students are often hesitant to even walk by when they're trying to walk to events at any of the houses at night, especially because the Brock Turner case last year, which was a sexual assault case that's currently still being decided in court, happened only 0.15 miles away from the path on similar terrain. So I think that's in the minds of students right now. Yeah, so last year I was an executive fellow for ASSU, which is our student government here on the Stanford campus. And so I operated the president at assu.stanford.edu email address. So I would see all of the concerns pouring into the email. And a lot of students were saying, hey, there's this huge path on campus that we all walk down on a day-to-day basis, and we're scared every night. And that's an issue. I mean, students shouldn't have to be feeling like that on their own home. So I want the university to pave and light the path. At this time, Stanford is home to an endangered salamander species, which is why we can't pave the path. However, after talking to the National Park Service, especially at Yosemite, I've found that when they have endangered species, they often build boardwalks over proposed paths that pose little to no harm to the environment, and are often easily approved by counties and states for endangered species. And we could easily just hang the lights off of the path so it would be boarded and lit. I think Cirie Path right now is the most tangible way that the university can support the movement against campus sexual assault and really take to heart that it is on them to help us stop campus sexual assault, and they need to start taking responsibility for their students being injured like that. I think that the Brock Turner case brought a lot of light onto the issue that we have here, and as we all know, a lot of those cases go unreported because students don't feel welcome to report. And so I think this might bring a more welcoming atmosphere to campus where students feel safe and secure and cared for by their university and their home.
Okay, well, that was great to hear from Alexis directly, and thanks for interviewing her for that. She's not the only person who's been working this fall, actually, since before school started, on the topic of sexual violence. There was a special workshop, seminar course, that some sophomores took, led by Michelle Dawber, a Stanford law professor, that really kind of brought the whole issue to educational kind of head. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Alexis was in this class that Michelle Dawber taught. It was called 1 in 5 for another controversial yet off-cited statistic on the prevalence of sexual assault on college campuses. And it was all about the law, policy, politics, retaliation, campus history, everything you can possibly imagine you need to learn about sexual assault at Stanford and nationally. These students got a 3-week crash course on.
Wow.
So they had lectures with Michelle, who's really an expert on the topic. And they had a bunch of guest speakers, both from the university and nationally known experts on issues. They traveled to New York and DC to meet with a New York Times journalist who's written about this. They went to a congressional hearing. And I attended the class at the very beginning, at the very end, and these students went through a total transformation of becoming, they were definitely interested, but with sort of a low-level understanding of these issues. And they're also, they were new students. They just finished their freshman year.
Were they all women who took this class?
Almost. There were 2 men, which was interesting, yeah.
And their majors were across the board, or mostly?
Yeah, totally across the board.
There
There's international relations. There was a journalism student who writes for The Daily, gender studies. There was a whole range.
Yeah.
And I think Michelle's goal with the class was really, it's only 12 students, but here are 12 students who you can educate, and then they will go forth in their respective fields or whatever they're interested in doing. And armed with that information, and really can make a difference across the university. And I think she accomplished that.
Yeah. Some people went out immediately. Those were the ones who were in White Plaza? Is that correct?
The rape happens here, and the flyers, those were some of their final projects for the class.
Yeah.
So some students did choose, there's sort of different levels of activism, and the students also talked about sort of what they were comfortable with doing, and there was a lot of fear around how the administration would respond to them and not wanting to be labeled troublemakers or sort of pointed out by the university. And so some students chose the let's stand with signs and say that rape happens here, and Alexis chose to continue her pushing in the university, which had started before the class, but to light Cirie Path.
Yeah. So there was someone, too, who had an issue with the administration over flyers that they were handing out?
Yeah, it was sort of muddled. But and Michelle had all the students, before they went out and did their various projects, read up on Stanford's policies on student freedom of speech and what you can and can't do, and the free speech hour at White Plaza and all of that. So they knew what they were doing. They didn't just go out and do it willy-nilly. But this one student put some pretty straightforward educational flyers directed at parents on cars, and apparently violated policy. But 20 minutes after flying cars, got an email from an administrator telling him to stop. And I think there's also a sensitivity around orientation week, when there are new students and new parents on campus.
Right, the first impressions that are made.
Right, exactly. And that was
university.
and then there was also, when the students were out at White Plaza, a administrator from the sexual assault relationship abuse office came by and sort of commented that the signs could be triggering for survivors. And that was something that the students had considered, and they had consulted with Alex Brodsky, the woman from Gale, who's done a lot of similar activism, and advised them you sort of just have to weigh that against, generating awareness about these issues.
Yeah, difficult.
Governor Brown is just about to sign, or has signed a new ordinance that will basically make it mandatory to have sex education in all of the schools. I wondered if, and part of that sex education is supposed to also be about assaults and sexual misconduct. So I wonder a little bit about, at universities, could there be sort of a mandatory, has anybody considered a mandatory class, so that everyone, including all of the men, are also educated as to what the laws really are?
Stanford rolled out either last year or this year a new education around sexual assault and consent and bystander intervention, all of that for during new student orientation. So they have made that more robust than in past years. But at the same time, that happens during a flurry of all these events that they're going to during their orientation week. And I think there's a feeling that, even being required to watch a video or going to a skit or having an all freshman event where you talk about these issues is great, but it really needs to go beyond that. It needs to be sustained throughout the year and throughout all 4 years.
Right. And is that something that they plan to do, to have something sustained throughout all of the years?
They've talked about doing more in the realm of education. I'm not sure exactly what they're going to do. They definitely started with doing more with freshmen, and they're doing more with graduate students too. And some of the numbers in the climate survey did indicate that freshmen who had just gone through the new programming did feel more comfortable with around issues or like concepts of consent and also Stanford's own processes and what you can do when you're sexually assaulted.
Perhaps education is the next point of student activism.
Yeah.
In terms of sexual violence education. You know, returning to the survey real quick before we wrap up, I was interested to see that they also surveyed people on attitudes and awareness of sort of not racist remarks, homophobic remarks or sexist remarks, and that perception of Stanford culture of having a high percentage of people who said that they definitely overheard some remark about
jokes
appearance,
about
women, your one's appearance, someone else's appearance. That kind of climate was also highlighted in the ASSU comment on the survey that they were calling for a much more accepting, tolerant, and non-discriminatory just kind of environment for the whole campus.
Yeah, and I should mention also that LGBTQ students, it seems like the university is really feeling them in multiple ways, and that came out in the climate survey. Both in they had lower numbers of student respondents, but very high rates sort of across the board when it came to sexual violence, and also very low dissatisfaction with campus mental health services.
And they also had a very higher rate than everybody else in terms of overhearing or being directed, having comments directed at them that were sexual in nature and derogatory. And you have to wonder if that also, points to more abuses that are much more on a physical level.
Yeah.
Well, all these issues to be decided, discussed, and acted upon in the coming months and years. We'll look for some kind of movement on Alexis Callan's Cirie Path project and see where she gets with that. So for all the news, you can always turn to www.paloaltoonline.com or find us on Twitter at Palo Alto Weekly. That wraps it up for today.